Well, I get to relive my career vicariously through my son. I have a 19-year-old son who's a drummer and in his own band. And, I know the moves I had to make in the 80s when I was coming up and all the things I had to do and a lot of the mistakes I made to work my way up the ladder. I don't regret any of them. They were all part of the learning process for me, and they were all part of how I evolved. But my son is following in my steps, 30 years later. And I think he's able to learn from a lot of the things I went through. And it's a different world, like the way I had to do it 30 years ago. He's got to do it very differently these days for all the reasons that we're talking about here. It's just a completely different world. The internet is the biggest part of it. And like I've already said, the internet has had its pros and its cons for the music industry. So you just kind of have to, roll with the punches and change with the times. You can't fight change, so you have to embrace it and somehow make it work for you.
When you hear people say rock is dead, what do you think? What does that mean to you, that expression?
Well, rock is dead. First of all, I think of The Who, Long Live Rock. But I guess there's two ways of looking at it. Are we talking about the music or the business? Because if you're talking about the music, I couldn't disagree more. I mean, I think rock as an art form just keeps growing and growing and blossoming, and you have all these subgenres that just keep growing, and you have all the great music from 50 years ago and all the great music being made today. So musically, I couldn't disagree more. But if you're talking about as a business, it's
in what way?
Well, as an art form, it's not dead. It's alive and well and kicking and always will be. But as a business, it's harder and harder, in modern times for not only musicians to make a living, but even the people that are not the musicians, record companies or instrument selling companies or retailers, whether it be music stores that sell instruments or record stores that sell CDs and records. Rock as a business is going through the toughest times it's ever been through. There could only be one Beatles. What happened for Elvis can only ever happen once. And then the Beatles came around and you had four Elvises, and then they changed everything. And, when music was happening in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, things were being done for the first time. But now that we're 50 years into rock, what could still be done that hasn't been done? I don't know if there will ever be a band like that. I mean, forget about the Beatles. There'll never be another band like the Beatles or Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd. But even, you move into the 80s and then, bands like U2 or Metallica or Guns N' Roses came around, and they could still sell stadiums. But I don't think there's going to be any band coming around in 2018 or 2020 that can blow up on that level, selling out stadiums.
Why do you feel that way?
Because it's all been done. It's all been done. I mean, and when I won't even talk about the Beatles. Let's go to the 80s, talking about U2, Metallica, Guns N' Roses. They were selling millions and millions and millions of records. That doesn't happen anymore. When I was coming around, you had thousands of bands selling millions of records. Now you have millions of bands selling thousands of records. Artists and musicians have to think of new ways to make a living.
Is this the internet's fault?
Yeah, it is. It is. I think, obviously when Napster came around in the late 90s or early 2000s, there was a big stink about it. And Lars Ulrich went in there fighting for musicians and ended up getting torn to shreds. But here we are almost 20 years later, and I think Lars was spot on correct, actually. A band like Metallica can survive, but if you're a new young band and you're trying to sell units or sell concert tickets, it's got to be impossible. There's millions of bands out there. Every kid can make a record right in their own basement on their own Pro Tools setup with, drum machines and things like that, and then have it being played everywhere from Australia to Brazil to, Omaha, Nebraska the next day on YouTube or social medias.
How do you feel about piracy? I spoke with Steve Albini recently, and he was saying he doesn't agree with the term piracy because he feels like it's actually, if you're savvy, you can use that extra publicity for your own benefit. How do you feel about that?
Well, those are two completely different terms, publicity and piracy. There's two completely different things. Piracy is somebody stealing your music or your film or whatever, whatever your art is, for free on the internet. Talking about publicity, that's a whole other thing. I mean, that's when you're trying to promote something. But people that actually literally just take the music for free, I mean, that's what's killed the industry. I mean, that's, like I said, when I was coming out with Dream Theater back 30 years ago in the mid 80s, you sell 1 million records then. Nowadays, a brand new band will come out and sell 500 units. Like, it's impossible for bands to make a living. They can get the music out there. It depends what your goal is. If your goal is to sell units and make money, it's impossible. If your goal is to just get your music heard, well then, you have greater outlets than ever before. So in that respect, the internet's been a great thing. When I was coming up in the 80s, you couldn't get your music heard unless you had a record deal, you signed away a 7-album deal, and you had to be in Rolling Stone magazine or be on MTV. There was no other way to get your music heard. That's the good side of it, is these days you can do that without having to sign your life away. So that's the only plus side that the internet has afforded a lot of musicians today. I don't think we can have another Beatles or another Led Zeppelin or another U2, but those are just numbers. Those are numbers, but I'm not talking about artistically. Artistically, there's bands that I love just as much as the Beatles that move me just as much, or I hear them creating art that is incredibly inspired. So yeah, there's no question that there's still artists that come around that can move the needle and either make music or make an artistic or social statement. Yeah, I mean, even before Kurt Cobain and Nirvana, you had the Sex Pistols. I remember like the late 70s, Prague was killed off and disco was huge, and then the punk movement came around, and like the Sex Pistols and the Clash and the Ramones just changed everything. And then it happened again in the 90s with the grunge movement and Kurt Cobain and all the other bands that followed in that way. Yeah, they'll always be an outlet for musicians or artists that have a social voice or that do things that are extreme to really excite people. Yeah, that'll never change.
Thanks, man.
Cool. Thank you.